All right, COVID-19 pandemic chronology video for today. I'm filming this Sunday to October 2022. What is going on with the pandemic today? Well, I decided to cover pandemic. I'm gonna call it like chatter. Like what are people talking about? What is the social rhythm around the pandemic these days, specifically today? And yes, I know it's early in the day. I was the last person up in this household. Okay. So the ongoing social chatter is whether we're at the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like, is it going to end? And I think there's a large group of people that think the COVID-19 pandemic will be over, done, gone by Veterans Day 2020, which is in November, the first half of November 2022. And I do not work for the medical industry. I do not know if that's the case. There's a lingering question. So with the swine flu, the medical industry didn't really, when it ended, so when the swine flu pandemic ended in 2010, there was not really much description of like how does a pandemic end and where's the line between the virus and the societal / medical structures that allow for a pandemic to continue, because the pandemic is technically reports of cases. A virus could exist throughout the world and not be a pandemic if nobody reports it, right? That was kind of like the question. And I knew people who were in the kind of dealing with the swine flu and stuff, and even they wouldn't provide clarity on that. And it was just kind of an interesting thing where it's like there's a difference between medical industry sometimes and like medical reality, and right, it's a kind of interesting system if the medical industry goes, you know what, we're tired of this virus, we're just going to shut down testing sites and say it's over even though it's still out there. And that on some level. So the people in the medical industry that, like, not all of them, but there were some of them that were kind of, this is for the swine flu pandemic, they were like, the virus is gone. The swine flu virus is gone. It is never going to come back. It's dead. The pandemic is over. There's no way this virus could ever come back. And then in 2015, there was a large flare-up of swine flu, and were at least socially, I was going through like graduate school visits and stuff like that, and it was something that was being talked about was whether or not like travel would be affected if the cases continued to rise with this swine flu pulse. Or we were talking about it and then this pulse happened after we were talking about it or something like that. But it came back, and there were people who were kind of pissed off because they were like, doctors said this virus couldn't come back. And sure enough, it came back. So, and I think the people I knew who didn't outright kind of lie, so to speak, who worked for the medical industry, phrased it a bit differently. It was, what happens with these viruses is they debut at the pandemic level. So they outbreak, spread to pandemic, they subside, they don't disappear, they subside, they're still there. It's just, the cases globally might not be very many. So they're still around. It's just that it's not really a big deal because there's not a whole lot of cases, kind of thing. It's no longer a pandemic. And so what these viruses, like at the time it was swine flu, happen with them is a lot of people will just say they don't exist, even though they do, because they're not at the same level they kind of like broke through at. It's kind of funny, in writing about swimmers, there's like a similar thing. If somebody's not competing at the World Championships, they're not competing. That's kind of a, they must be off grid because they're not at the World Championships. No, that's not how that works. But depending on what one's watching, it might like feel like they're not around, but they could be competing in like 20 different competitions a year. Like they could be doing every stop of the Swimming World Cup, which has 14 stops in a like said year, not this year, but and then they're doing what they would do at a World Championships 14 times, which is far more impressive than just doing it once. So there's a kind of interesting corollary between swimmers and international, like on the international stage, and pandemics in that sense, of what happens if they're not at the global level. And so I think with the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the concerns and the kind of social chatter towards the beginning for part of why the lockdowns at the beginning were kind of so strict were, especially compared to the swine flu pandemic, a bit of it was swine flu came back 5 years later. It might not have hit everything. It was not a pandemic again, but the virus itself did flare up. So there was a bit of people wanted at the beginning. Some people, not everybody was thinking about the swine flu and what happened there, but some people were of it would be better to lock down and just get through this virus, get rid of it, and then open back up kind of thing. I don't know if that's still the sentiment now. Some people might be okay with the COVID-19 pandemic ending and then it flares up again 5 years later and we just go through all of this over again for the same virus, COVID-19. And so maybe a different strain or strains at that point in time. But that was, yeah. I will also say, this is just a note, like a curiosity note. Between and following the news for both the swine flu pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic, strains of the virus and mutations have been talked about far more, at least socially, during this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, than swine flu pandemic. That might be different somewhere else in the world, but it was just an interesting observation I've made versus, and for the swine flu pandemic, there was a bunch of, they didn't have the test sites they needed and stuff like that. And so there was a bunch of, well, for the next pandemic, let's try and have those test sites. And the next pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, they did. So, I mean, the swine flu pandemic and steps taken during that one for the things they didn't have led to like large scale success this time around. Yeah, so there's a bit of, I don't know, like that's kind of, the swine flu pandemic was the biggest one in my lifetime before COVID-19 pandemic, so that's why I'm bringing it up, that's kind of my reference. There was an end and not really transparency from the medical industry communicated to the public about the difference between the medical industry just getting tired and being like, we don't want to deal with this anymore. We want to go back to researching our own projects, kind of thing. And the virus is actually gone because the virus was still around and came back in larger numbers. So, not pandemic again, that's swine flu. So I guess there's a little bit of, I think there was a social push with this pandemic, a little bit from the people who remembered swine flu and the pandemic and it flaring up again was, can we not have the flare up? And I don't know if that's really the case. Like if people are thinking about that, I am, but I don't know if the medical industry is. I think there's probably a fair amount of wear and just kind of getting tired in the sense of a lot of the people I knew in biology and chemistry and the medical industry, they love like researching what they want to research, and a bunch of money has been put into COVID-19 and stuff, and so there's a bit of, when a virus breaks out, there is a disruption to it's not what they wanted to do, right? They were working on 3-5 year grant programs for something entirely different, and then they were siphoned into the COVID-19 stuff, right? So there's a bit of, they might not want to work on it, and they didn't want to work on it in the first place. They've been working on it, and now they want to go back to what they wanted to work on. So there's a bit of, yeah, just a reality check of it disrupted their life and what they were working on and work too, which some people don't really heed, but it does matter. And it does affect kind of the morale in around combating the virus, so to speak. But yeah, that is the topic of today, is social chatter around, is the pandemic ending, with people thinking it'll be gone by Veterans Day this year, so November 2022. So I have no idea. I have no guesses. I don't work for the medical industry. I just shared my perspective a bit on kind of the state, not the state, perspective on swine flu pandemic ending, and not extrapolated to this pandemic because I don't have a guess, but just shared my perspective. Yeah. So have a happy, it's so Sunday, 2 October 2022 when I'm filming this. Have a happy day. Yeah. Be it this day I'm filming this or a later day.